What is good, everyone? Welcome to the channel. My name is Paul and I make videos about Japanese society, life, and culture from the viewpoint of a long-term foreign resident. I've lived in Japan about 18 years now. My topic this week is inspired by another Japan YouTuber, Let's Ask Shogo, who did a video earlier this week on reasons why you might not want to live in Japan. And I thought I would do a video on the same topic because his reasons were very general, as in they could apply to anyone, including Japanese people. So I thought I would do a video where I talk about specifically reasons why you might not want to live in Japan as a foreigner. So I'm going to do specifically foreigner-related reasons. So this might seem like a negative topic. It might seem like I'm going to bash Japan or complain about Japan, and that's actually not my intention at all. I'm just going to put some facts out there for you to judge yourself. And as I mentioned, I've been here for 18 years. Clearly the good outweighs the bad, and that none of these reasons I'm going to talk about today were a deal breaker for me at all. So again, I'm not going to complain about Japan. I'm just going to tell you these things exist and you can judge for yourself. So without further ado, the first reason why you might not want to live in Japan as a foreigner is you're always going to stand out. If you're visibly foreign, visibly not Japanese like me, you're never really going to be accepted in society immediately. Every time you meet new people, it's always going to be the assumption that, oh, he doesn't speak Japanese probably, or he probably doesn't understand Japanese culture, or, can he use chopsticks, that kind of thing. And maybe the assumption will be that I'm probably a tourist. And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with any of that. I'm not actually going to tell you this is a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a thing. It's just the way it is. Obviously, the people who know me, they accept me as a resident and as someone who knows Japanese culture and can function in the society. But most of the public, of course, does not know who I am. So it's only natural that would happen, basically. So what I'm getting at is, does it bother you or not? So if it really bothers you to be kind of othered and never really feel like you fit in your daily life and society, then living in Japan is going to be a little bit difficult. Last week's video I made about most common complaints that foreigners make about Japan. Well, one of those was being handed an English menu, and that's by foreign residents that kind of get upset that the assumption is they don't read or speak Japanese. And that's not a complaint that I actually care about because it just doesn't bother me. If it bothers you, Japan could become like a death by 1,000 cuts type place, and you won't want to live here in the long term. But on the other hand, if you're like me and it just kind of rolls off your back or you don't even notice it, then you'll have no trouble living here at all. The second reason why you might not want to live in Japan as a foreigner is lack of chances for career advancement. And I mean this in pretty much every field you can possibly think of. It's just the fact that in many industries, in fact most industries, it's going to be harder to advance in your career, including my own. I mean, some people might think that a university teacher, well, okay, now you're on a tenure track, or you've got some kind of career track that's going to, propel you forward. But there are a lot of university lecturers here who are on contract to contract, and they've been here a long time, and that contract has never changed. It's still the same salary, the same benefits. It's just, there's a lot of potentially dead-end career choices in Japan for foreigners. And again, I'm not even going to comment whether I think this is right or wrong. It's certainly not unique to Japan. Obviously, there's plenty of other countries where if you are not a citizen, you're not going to be able to get into certain positions. But, in Japan, at least it's clear from the outset. It's not a glass ceiling, it's a steel ceiling. I mean, you're not going to get much farther than this point. So if you're in a career where that's not an issue, or you're not worried about advancing in a career as you grow older, then maybe Japan is just fine for you. But if you're worried that you're going to end up in a dead-end sort of career or job, then Japan might be a risk. All right, before I get into the final 2 reasons you might not want to live in Japan as a foreigner, I just want to again remind everyone that I have a podcast called The Journal of Japan Journeys, and in that podcast, I'm interviewing other long-term foreign residents. It's all about getting the ideas and stories out there about why some people do live in Japan for so long and choose to make Japan their long-term home. So if you're interested in hearing the stories of people for whom today's reasons I'm giving you don't apply, then I invite you to listen to the Journal of Japan Journeys podcast. I will link it in the description below. Okay, the third reason why you might not want to live in Japan as a foreigner is it might get tiring to be always scapegoated for problems in society. Case in point, the most recent pandemic. Japan took the most strict path in terms of banning foreigners from coming back into the country. It was the only rich nation that did not allow resident foreigners to return. So imagine that. There were 3 or 4 months during the pandemic when people whose entire life is in Japan were not allowed to return. Japan also didn't allow tourists in for the longest time, even after much of the rest of the world had kind of opened up again. And these policies were very popular with the public. So just something to keep in mind that I guess it goes back to not really ever fitting in. You're not going to be considered a part of society here by officialdom in those ways. This actually has a long history. Back in the 1920s, when the Great Kanto earthquake happened, rumors started flying that Korean residents were poisoning wells, and so violent acts were taken out against Korean residents. Even more recently, the now deceased former governor of Tokyo, Ishihara, was once quoted saying to Japanese self-defense forces that in the case of a major natural disaster, they have to be ready to quell any riots and looting by foreigners specifically. So obviously he was painting the picture that it's going to be the foreigners who are going to go out of control and loot and riot if there was a major earthquake. Police and media will often bring out foreign crime statistics to try to show that foreigners are more likely to be criminals. And while that's technically true, the truth is actually much deeper in that if you remove the crime of visa violation, which is by far the most common crime by foreigners, and obviously a crime that Japanese themselves cannot commit, if you remove that statistic, robbery, rape, murder, assault, all of those other crimes are committed by foreigners less per capita than native Japanese people. And I think when most people think of crime and criminals, they're thinking of those latter acts, not visa violation. So the truth of the statistics is actually that foreigners commit less crimes than native Japanese, unless you're counting the visa violations. So again, the point I'm making is not the right or wrong of this, just that it's a fact that you're going to have these occasional comments by politicians. You're going to have official policies that seem to tell the world that Japan believes foreigners are more likely to be carriers of corona and that they're less likely to follow the rules in terms of trying not to spread the disease, etc., which is simply not the case. Japan had its big, huge waves of corona cases just like everywhere else in the world. And that was, Japanese tourists who were traveling to Hawaii and Europe and everywhere else. And corona had no problem spreading around in Japan. So keeping the foreigners out was, I guess, good PR by the government. Again, if that kind of thing bothers you, then Japan might feel like an unhospitable place to live. Inhospitable, I think is the word. However, if you can just kind of let that slide and be like, okay, it's a reality, but it doesn't affect my daily life, then you can probably live in Japan. Again, not saying it's right or wrong, just that that's the way it is. Okay, the final reason why you may not want to live in Japan as a foreigner is you are always going to be at a disadvantage when it's you versus a Japanese person. And I'm not just talking about for promotion at a business like I talked about in reason 2. I'm talking about it from the standpoint of if anything bad ever goes down, and it's your word against a Japanese person, the police or the officials are going to believe the Japanese person. And that's been demonstrated again and again in sort of he said, she said crime that have been reported on in the media. And it's just a fact that, you know, the Japanese person's word is going to hold more weight. I've even seen this. I can give two personal anecdotes of acquaintances of mine. An acquaintance of mine was being chased by this Japanese guy threatening violence, and he ran into a convenience store, and the convenience store clerk called the cops. The police arrive and immediately try to put my acquaintance into handcuffs, and it took the clerk's intervention to say, no, it's that guy who's being violent, not the foreigner. So the assumption immediately was that the foreigner was the person causing the problem. The other anecdote was someone who lives not so far away from me in Yokohama, and he had parked his car outside of his house, and he walked into his house, and while he was in there, he heard the sound of an accident. Some driver had come and bashed into his parked car. Now, when the police arrived at the accident site, the Japanese guy spun this story about how my acquaintance was backing out of his driveway and caused the accident. And of course, the police were going to take the Japanese guy's word, until my acquaintance remembered he lived close to a park that had a security camera that actually showed the front of his house. And so they got the footage from the security camera, and it showed clearly that there wasn't anyone even in his car at the time of the accident. The kicker to all that is the police officer involved was angry, not at the Japanese guy for telling the lie and making a false report, but at the foreign acquaintance of mine. He was angry that the foreigner was causing this problem, and basically he was upset that he wasn't going to get to arrest the foreigner, or at least pin everything on the foreigner. Finally, there was even a former prosecutor who worked in Osaka, I believe, who was basically said in an interview that they were taught to basically treat foreigners as not having any rights when they're arrested and in detention. And you know, if it's officialdom or it's official policy that the foreigner is likely to be the criminal and that they don't have the same rights as other Japanese, it makes, you know, it's kind of that nightmare scenario, getting accused of something you didn't do. If that's a fear that you really have in your life, then again, maybe Japan might not be the place for you to live. Okay, that is the end of today's episode. I want to thank you very, very much for watching. Please remember to hit like and subscribe if you haven't done that already and you're at this point in the video. What are you doing? Now's the time. But again, thank you for watching this particular video. I put out a new one every Friday, and I hope to see you next time. Peace.